There are moments when time itself feels heavy, when the air carries memory. Tonight is one of those moments. January 28th is not just a date on a calendar, it is a spiritual doorway. I know how that sounds to some, but I speak from a place I once used in darkness and now standing by light. There are windows in the spirit, and there are hours when bloodline patterns are either reinforced or finally shattered. I didn't learn this in church first. I learned it in places people don't like to talk about, places where ancestors are invoked, where family names are studied, where patterns are traced through blood, trauma, miscarriages, addictions, divorces, sudden deaths, repeated poverty, repeated betrayal. In those rooms, nothing was random. Dates mattered, hours mattered, prayer times mattered, even when people didn't call them prayers. That's why tonight matters. There are 3 prayer times across January 28th, 29, and 30 that directly confront generational bloodline assignments, not surface problems, not emotional cycles. I'm talking about legal spiritual claims that travel through family lines carried by agreements made before you were born. Agreements some of you never signed, but still paid for. I used to help enforce those claims, and that's why I need you to listen slowly. Generational assignments don't usually attack loudly, they repeat quietly. A grandmother who was abandoned, a mother who was betrayed, a daughter who cannot trust, a son who cannot stay sober. Same story, different decade. People call it bad luck or family traits. In the spirit realm, it is called continuity. Continuity only survives when no one interrupts it. That interruption begins tonight, but only if you understand when to pray, not just what to pray. Most people pray emotionally. They pray when they are overwhelmed. They pray when something breaks. But generational assignments are not emotional contracts. They are time contracts, and contracts are challenged at appointed hours. January 28th carries the first window. This is the day patterns resist exposure. It is the day family secrets tighten their grip. It's the day when people suddenly feel tired, distracted, heavy, or spiritually dull without knowing why. That resistance is not random, it is defensive. The first prayer time is not loud warfare, it is alignment. Late night prayers on January 28th, when the house is quiet and the body wants rest, are dangerous to bloodline spirits because that hour is when ancestral monitoring is weakest. They expect exhaustion, they expect delay, they expect I'll pray tomorrow. Tomorrow is how cycles survive. Tonight, prayer is not about shouting, it is about standing. It is about saying I am awake in a bloodline that has been asleep. When I was in darkness, this was the hour we feared the most, not because of noise, but because of awareness. A single person in a family who becomes conscious breaks decades of leverage. You don't need perfect words, you need positioning. You speak over your name, over your mother's name, over your father's line. You say, anything assigned to this blood that did not originate with God, lose recognition of me. You are not begging, you are declaring separation. That's part 1. But listen carefully. This is only the first cut, not the full destruction. January 29th is different. If January 28th is exposure, January 29th is confrontation. This is where many people stop praying because emotions rise, memories surface, dreams intensify, old wounds ache. People think something is going wrong, but it's actually evidence something is being challenged. In the occult, January 29th was used for reinforcement rituals. This is when ancestral spirits attempt to reassert ownership by reminding you of pain. They replay scenes, the rejection, the abuse, the loss. The goal is agreement. If you agree emotionally, the contract strengthens. That's why the second prayer time is dangerous, because it breaks emotional consent. But I won't go fully there yet. What I need you to understand right now is this. Generational assignments are not broken in one moment. They are dismantled in stages: exposure, confrontation, then collapse. Too many people pray exposure prayers and stop. They see truth, feel relief, then wonder why patterns return. Because exposure without confrontation is information, not freedom. Tonight is about positioning yourself for the next 2 days. You may already feel resistance as you listen. Your mind may wander. You may feel sleepy, irritated, or skeptical. That's not your personality. It's pressure. Pressure always shows up before release. I remember the first time I stood on the opposite side of this. I expected chaos. I expected retaliation. What I didn't expect was silence. A strange, hollow silence, like something searching for authority and finding none. That silence comes when timing is respected. January 28th is the night you signal withdrawal from inherited agreements. You are not fighting yet, you are notifying, and notice is powerful. In legal terms, spiritual or natural, once notice is given, enforcement without consent becomes illegal. That's why these prayer times are structured. Heaven operates with order. Darkness does too. You don't break bloodline chains by accident. You do it on purpose. Tonight when you pray, don't rush. Don't multitask. Don't scroll and speak. Sit. Breathe. Let your spirit come forward. Say your own name out loud. It matters more than you think. And if you feel nothing, that's okay. Authority is not a feeling, it's a position. Tonight, you don't break everything. Tonight, you make sure everything knows. You are no longer available. By the time January 29th arrives, something has already shifted. You may not be able to explain it, but you can feel it. The air feels thicker. Sleep may have been interrupted. Dreams may have become vivid, symbolic, even unsettling. That is not coincidence. That is confrontation beginning. January 28th was notice. January 29 is resistance. This is the day generational bloodline assignments attempt to re-establish authority, not through power, but through memory. Because memory is how cycles survive. Pain remembered without healing becomes permission. Trauma revisited without truth becomes agreement. And agreement is the fuel bloodline spirits run on. I've watched this happen from the other side. When a person withdraws consent on the first night, the system doesn't immediately collapse. It pushes back, it tests, it asks, are you serious, or was that emotional? That's why January 29th feels heavier for many people than January 28th. It's not because you're losing ground, it's because you're threatening it. This is the day-old, emotions resurface without warning. Sudden sadness, sudden anger, sudden snorts fear, thoughts that don't sound like your own, memories you haven't thought about in years, even physical sensations, tight chest, headaches, heaviness in the stomach. These are not random. They are signals that the assignment is being confronted at the emotional gate. Generational curses hide in emotions because emotions feel personal. But many of the feelings you carry did not originate with you. They were inherited, normalized, and passed down as just how our family is. January 29th is when that lie is exposed. This is why the second prayer time is critical. It is not prayed casually, it is prayed deliberately, and it is prayed when emotions are active, not when everything feels calm, because authority exercised under pressure carries more weight. The second prayer time is not about ancestors, it is about agreement. You confront the emotional contracts that were never yours to sign. When I was in darkness, this was the phase we relied on most. If we could trigger emotion, we could delay freedom. If someone cried but didn't confront, we still held ground. Tears without authority never broke chains. They only softened the surface. That's why this prayer is different. You do not pray from emotion. You pray over emotion. You say, every emotional response in me that was trained by trauma, inherited fear, or bloodline memory, I revoke your authority to speak for me. That sentence alone destabilizes generations because once emotion loses authority, manipulation collapses. This is the night people feel like giving up, like skipping prayer, like saying, I'll continue tomorrow. That thought is not fatigue, it is our assistance. Because January 29th is the day confrontation must happen before collapse is allowed. Let me tell you something important. Bloodline assignments cannot survive confrontation without consent. They can intimidate, they can provoke, they can recall pain, but they cannot override free will once it is exercised with clarity. That's why the enemy doesn't try to stop you with force. It tries to stop you with feeling. This is also the day relational patterns scream the loudest. Thoughts about past partners, family conflicts replaying in your mind, old words echoing, this always happens to us. No one in our family ever. Those phrases are verbal seals. January 29th is when they must be broken. You do not argue with them. You replace them. You speak truth where memory once ruled. And here's something most people don't realize. When you confront emotional inheritance, you are not only freeing yourself, you are weakening the structure behind the pattern for everyone connected to your line. One person standing interrupts the supply chain. That's why some of you feel pressure not to continue. The system knows what's coming next. January 29th, prayer is firm, not frantic. You don't shout at darkness. You strip it of relevance. You say, I refuse to emotionally agree with cycles I did not create. Agreement is everything. In the Spirit realm, power follows agreement more than volume. That's why calm authority terrifies what noise never could. I remember the first time I saw a bloodline assignment collapse at this stage. There was no dramatic manifestation, no chaos, just a sudden loss of grip, like fingers unclenching because there was nothing left to hold. That happens when emotional consent is removed. This is also the day forgiveness becomes strategic. Not emotional forgiveness, but authoritative release. Not because they deserve it, but because unforgiveness keeps emotional access points open. You don't forgive to feel better. You forgive to close doors. January 29th is not gentle. It is precise. You may feel exposed, but exposure is not vulnerability. It's clarity, and clarity is lethal to deception. As this day closes, something important happens. The pressure begins to break. The mind clears. The emotions settle. Not because the fight is over, but because the grip is loosening. That's when collapse becomes possible. January 30th is the final phase. January 30 is not confrontation. January 30 is termination. It is the prayer that seals what the other 2 days unlocked. It is the prayer that stops repetition. Not just for you, but for the generations after you. But collapse only happens when exposure and confrontation are honored. That's why you couldn't skip this day. If January 28th awakened you and January 29 tested you, then January 30 will free you. No, I will walk you through the final prayer time. The one that ends bloodline assignments, seals identity, and ensures the cycle does not rebuild quietly in the future. Stay positioned. You are closer than you think. By the time January 30th arrives, the atmosphere changes. Not dramatically, not loudly. It becomes clear. The heaviness that pressed on your chest begins to lift. The emotional static fades. Thoughts slow down. And many people mistake this calm for completion. But January 30th is not the day to relax. It is the day to seal. In the spirit realm, exposure removes cover. Confrontation removes agreement, but sealing removes access. Without sealing, cycles can attempt to rebuild quietly, subtly, years later, using new situations that look different but feel familiar. That's why many people think they're free, only to recognize the same pattern wearing a new face. January 30th, the day that ends repetition. This is the collapse prayer. Collapse does not look like a fight. It looks like finality, like paperwork stamped closed, like authority recognized, without argument. This is why the third prayer time is often the calmest and the most powerful. When I was in darkness, this was the phase we hated the most because there is nothing to negotiate once sealing happens. No emotional loopholes, no ancestral appeal, no future access. This is when bloodline assignments lose the right to return. But sealing requires certainty. You cannot pray this prayer while unsure of who you are. That's why January 28 and 29 had to come first. Awareness, confrontation, now identity. January 30. Prayer is not about your past. It is about your position. You are no longer speaking as a descendant. You are speaking as a boundary. This is where many people misunderstand spiritual authority. They think authority comes from intensity. It doesn't. Authority comes from alignment, from standing where you actually belong. You don't ask or release here. You announce conclusion. You say, I am no longer a carrier of inherited assignments. That sentence alone redraws the line because once you stop carrying, the system collapses from lack of host. Generational curses need continuity. They require someone to agree, repeat, or tolerate. January 30 is when tolerance ends. This is also the prayer time where names matter. Not the names of spirits, not the names of ancestors, but your name. You speak your name out loud clearly without fear. You claim it. You separate it. You say, my name is not a continuation. It is a reset. That is sealing language. I've seen bloodlines end in one generation because one person finally sealed the door instead of just walking out. Walking out leaves the door open. Sealing closes it for everyone behind you. This is also the day where future generations are addressed. Not emotionally, but legally. You don't pray for them. You pray over the line. You say what stopped with me does not restart after me. The spirit realm recognizes that kind of declaration. January 30 is not a day of fear. It is a day of ownership. If January 29th felt like pressure, January 30 feels like authority settling into place. Some of you may feel peace. Others may feel strength. Some may feel nothing at all. None of that determines effectiveness. Effectiveness is determined by position, not sensation. This is also why distractions increase again on this day. Not emotional ones, practical ones, sudden errands, sudden obligations, sudden busyness, because sealing requires focus. and focus finalizes what resistance could not stop earlier. When you pray on January 30th, you're not addressing darkness. You are addressing heaven. You are saying this line ends here, and heaven responds to clarity. Let me be clear about something. Seeing is not dramatic. There are no fireworks. There is recognition, like a system updating its records, like authority shifting hands, like a lock changing codes. Once sealed, the assignment cannot legally operate even if it tries to whisper later, and it will try. But whispers without authority are just noise. This is where discernment matters. After January 30th, familiar thoughts may attempt to return, not with power, but with familiarity. The difference is this: they no longer compel, they no longer pull. You notice them and they dissolve. That's how you know sealing worked. Not because life becomes perfect, but because patterns lose momentum. What once dragged you now passes you by. What once repeated now stops at recognition. This is freedom most people never reach, not because it's unavailable, but because they never complete the process. They expose, they confront, but they don't seal. January 30 is your sealing day, and once sealed, you do not revisit the battle. You move forward, you build differently, you choose differently, you respond differently, not out of fear, but out of awareness. That's how bloodlines change, not with rebellion, not with noise, but with one person who finishes what others only started. If you've walked through January 28th, stood firm through January 239, then January 30 marks the end, not just of a cycle, but of an inheritance that was never meant to define you. You are not your bloodline's past, you are its boundary. And from this point forward, what follows you is not repetition, but freedom.